Hello, everyone, and thanks for being here. We're happy to follow some great remarks from Ambassador Tai. My name is Hannah Monican. I'm a senior correspondent at the Capitol Forum, and I'll be moderating our first panel today on the future of the U.S.-Mexico trade agreement. And to follow up on what Ambassador Tai said, we are going to try to speak to both the forest and the trees today. The USMCA was negotiated, as probably most of you know, to replace NAFTA during the first Trump administration. It includes a mandatory joint review 6 years after the agreement entered into force, so to take place later in about middle of next year. So the parties have the option to extend the deal for another 16-year term. If they choose not to, it will terminate after one 16-year period. So USTR is actively gathering stakeholder feedback, and I assume we will start to have a better sense of the administration's approach in the coming weeks. But in the meantime, we know what some of the key issues are likely to be: tariffs, China, rules of origin, labor rights and the rapid response mechanism, and digital trade, among a number of others. So with that, let me briefly introduce the great panel we have today, just to speak to some of these issues, and then we'll get right into it. So right next to me here, I have Patrick Childress. Pat is an international trade and disputes attorney and partner at Hall & Knight, where he helps business and industry groups navigate trade challenges, including related to tariffs and trade investigations. We also have Melinda St. Louis. Melinda is Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, an advocacy group fighting corporate influence in trade policy and pushing for greater transparency and accountability. Next to her is Jeffrey Vogt. Jeff is the Rule of Law Director at the Solidarity Center, co-founder of the International Lawyers Assisting Workers Network, and a member of the International Labor Organization governing body. And last but not least, we have Jared Wessel. Jared is a partner at Hogan Lovells, representing and advising clients on a range of trade issues, including trade remedies, international dispute settlement, and USMCA's rapid response mechanism. So to get us started, I'm going to give an opening question here that I would like all of our panelists to think about and maybe answer, because I think that can really set us up for the rest of our discussion, which is what issues are you sort of expecting the three parties to prioritize as a part of this review? And where do you anticipate the most outside pressure, whether we're talking about from civil society, business groups, Congress, or other stakeholders? Why don't we just sort of go down the line? Pat, can we start with you?
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be here today. Maybe before I talk about the specific issues, I'll step back a moment to look at this in an even broader context. So what is going to be the overarching dynamic at play in the USMCA review process? And I think that is this. I think the U.S. government will be in the position of the demandeur throughout this process, pushing for large-scale changes to the agreement as a part of the 6-year review. And then I think we'll see Canada and Mexico pushing back, hoping to maintain something closer to the status quo. Now, I do think Canada and Mexico recognize the fact that they will likely have to make concessions during this negotiation process in order to maintain the integrity of the trilateral agreement. In terms of specific issues, I think, of course, they'll be looking, the U.S. government in particular will be pushing on rules of origin, raising those standards. And we've also heard floated the idea of U.S.-specific rules of origin as well, not just regional rules of origin. And then finally, I think there will also be efforts to align the three parties with respect to China policy as well, potentially setting common tariff barriers on goods generally, but again, with the focus on goods coming in to North America from China.
Thanks. I would actually agree with a lot of what Patrick said in terms of what we probably will expect from the U.S. government and from the Canadian and Mexican governments. I do think that they are, the governments currently are eager to preserve whatever they can for the USMCA. But I will say that in terms of the issues that are being pushed not just in the United States, but also in Canada and Mexico around civil society particularly, is that they do not believe that the USMCA has delivered on the promises of of stopping offshoring, of raising standards at scale in Mexico, and particularly when it comes to the environment as well. And so we coordinate a lot with civil society, kind of broad sectors across the United States: labor, environment, family farm, faith groups, community groups, migrant justice groups, but then also in Canada and in Mexico. And there is a strong sense that the USMCA, as Ambassador Tai said, is still at its core, maintains much of the structure that of the old NAFTA that has not delivered for the majority. And so it does need to be significant that this review is an opportunity for to push to try to fix some of those things. But in terms of how that actually happens, big question. Will it be a trilateral? How does that happen in the context of the way that Donald Trump has been engaging in foreign policy? But happy to get into any of those issues in the discussion.
Right. Quickly, I mean, I think. As Ambassador Tai mentioned earlier, this agreement it goes well beyond traditional kind of trade between the three countries. So as far as who is going to be involved and interested and have a stake in this, I think it should be vast, because there's little of the economies of the three countries that are not touched in some degree by the agreement, whether it's on labor standards, whether it's on digital trade, whether it's on investments, or any number of issues that are in the agreement. I think for the AFL-CIO, the question of NAFTA, the question of USMCA, and the question of, frankly, any agreement has been, what is this agreement going to do to further the quality of life of the working people in the countries in which these agreements are bringing our economies closer together? Has it improved, right? And I think if you look at the evidence, and we'll look again just here, right, between the United States and Mexico, some of the issues that Melinda has also raised, we still see companies in the United States offshoring to Mexico, sometimes in unionized industries, looking for cheaper labor inputs, right? We still see, I think despite stronger labor disciplines in the USMCA, the fact that there's an annex that required Mexico to pass constitutional and labor law reforms, and I think very innovative mechanisms such as rapid response, that has had, I think, an important impact, but on a small segment of the Mexican workforce. So we still see a vast majority of workers who are still not reaping in Mexico, reaping the potential benefits of freedom of association, collective bargaining, and being able to bargain up their wages and working conditions. So the asymmetries that we were trying to address earlier through these mechanisms still isn't really being robustly addressed. That's not to say the only labor issues are in Mexico. We have companies here in the United States that are trying to declare the NLRB unconstitutional, right? Which maybe they need to be careful what they wish for. But we have our serious labor issues here. We need also to address in the United States.
I'll just preface this by, these are obviously my personal opinions, not those of my firm. I think two areas. One, I would expect the Mexican government to push for more reciprocity in the rapid response regime. As it currently exists, it's really only applicable to Mexican companies. It really doesn't apply to U.S. companies. It technically does, but as a matter of practice, it really doesn't. That kind of inherent unequalness, I expect, will be a source of tension, and I'll be interested to see where that goes. I also think on rapid response, I personally hope that there is thoughts to more due process in the regime. As somebody who represents employers, in rapid response, I mean, I have been taken back by some of the due process flaws. It's often the case that petitions are lodged that against my clients that I don't know about. I represent a group of Mexico in the rapid response case, and my clients were interviewed by the panel without me being allowed to participate. So I think there are some due process concerns that I really do hope are addressed. I think they can be addressed in a way too where employees and employers are allowed to participate with representatives in the same manner. I mean, I'm not simply trying to plug that employers should be allowed to enjoy these rights. I think both employee and employers should get enhanced rights. And also, I think somebody mentioned, I do expect the rules of origin to be a topic of great negotiations. I'm certainly aware that there's concern in the U.S. about Chinese industry in Mexico. I do worry about how that will be addressed. I think, one of the big talking points, I think, for Democrat and Republican administrations has been that to the extent we have issues with China, it's with the Chinese government. How do we navigate a country of origin rule in Mexico where it really goes after Chinese companies and Chinese citizens, potentially regardless of if they're affiliated with the government? How do we manage that? That's going to take a nuanced, I think, argument and nuanced press to make it clear that, why we're doing this and that it's not really targeting Chinese people. It's targeting the Chinese government. And I kind of wonder if the Trump administration can really address that nuance.
Yeah, I think you guys have all spoken to a number of sort of the key issues that we'll all be looking at sort of as this progresses. But I wanted to just take a step back, and a couple of you mentioned this also as you were speaking just now. But there's not a lot of, in the USMCA, not a lot of outlining of what this review should look like. So there's sort of a wide variance of what we can expect from the administration going forward and, from all the parties and how they're going to approach this, from full renegotiation and sort of, throwing out the deal and kind of starting from fresh, or, to tweaking around the edges and sort of just addressing some of these key pieces. So, I wanted to throw out there kind of what expectations you might see from going forward and kind of moving this forward, and what the administration and the other parties might be looking at, and where does this administration has not been very interested in having Congress play a huge role in its trade policy so far, and we see already that some lawmakers are starting to get a little bit peeved on some level with USTR, and they're recently not reporting to them in a way that they find that they should be. So, there's a lot of, angles here, but the dynamics can be very interesting in terms of how that moves some of these issues forward. And I know Pat and Melinda, especially, you spoke to this a little bit in your opening remarks. So maybe we can, just take this step back and think about what that approach might look like and how that affects, how some of these issues might play out. Do you want to start us off, Pat?
Sure. Thank you for that. And you're absolutely right that there's not much guidance given on what the substance of the review should be in the treaty. It's labeled in the treaty as a simple review. However, again, my full expectation, given the state of the trilateral trading relationship and the current administration's general, I think it's fair to say, aggressive approach on international trade broadly, I do fully expect that at least on the U.S. side, there will be a push for something closer to a full-scale renegotiation than a review. So that's on substance. There's also not a lot of guidance given on what the procedure is going to look like. And so that's another area that I have questions about, i.e. what is the actual negotiating structure going to look like over the next 7 months? Again, there's not any guidance in the treaty itself. And then I think I don't expect that this process is going to proceed like other trade negotiations have in the past, where there's a formal cadence of meetings, going from capital to capital, negotiating text in a standard way. I think the Trump administration has been pretty clear about this, that its preference is going to be to negotiate at least part of this agreement bilaterally. So I think there will be direct U.S.-Mexico and direct U.S.-Canada negotiations going forward. But again, it's not clear exactly what that cadence is going to look like, so it's something to keep an eye on going forward.
Yeah, and to address the question about Congress's role, I think it is what we saw yesterday from Senator Wyden and Congressman Neal expressing deep concern about the fact that the USMCA report that the administration is statutorily required to provide to Congress, that was in the implementing legislation, by January 2nd, is not going to be a written report, but just an oral discussion next week, and to the committees of jurisdiction. And, and I think that really raises a lot of concerns about how much corporate capture we may end up seeing in this negotiation. If this isn't something that is made public and we know what the goals are, I think speculating, it's unclear exactly why that is. Perhaps it's that they don't have a real roadmap yet. I mean, we know that there are conflicting approaches within the administration, and obviously President Trump himself throws wrenches into plans pretty regularly in terms of what is going to happen. But I think that we also saw more than 140 congressional Democrats have sent letters in recent weeks as part of the comment process calling for very specific changes to the agreement. So I think Congress is paying attention. They, particularly Democrats, I think are wanting to assert Congress's role. It's interesting that during the Biden administration, Congress on a bipartisan basis often would say we want to assert our authority, and we're not seeing that as much this time around, given I think the deference that the congressional Republicans have been ceding to the administration on a lot of issues. So I think this, it's very clearly Congress's constitutional authority over trade agreements. And I mean, one concern I have too, in addition, not just the USMCA, but others, is that because these have been such one-sided deals, and that the Trump administration wants all the other countries to make concessions, but the United States not, to say, oh, well, we're not really changing U.S. law, so we don't need to come to Congress. But in fact, you're actually really changing the rules of the game internationally and global trade rules. And that is another area where Congress and the public has a right to know and should be engaged and consulted.
I think this will be really interesting in terms of how some of these nitty-gritty issues that we'll now get into, but how Congress is involved and how the administration approaches this review, I think will ultimately be very interesting in terms of how some of these issues actually get resolved. Speaking to some, I think, Pat and Jared, I think especially you spoke to this a little bit about rules of origin and the concerns about China. There's a lot of, obviously a lot of concern about China. That's a big focus for this administration. We can, I think, expect that there will be certainly something will happen on rules of origin or regional content value. I'm sure there's a lot of different ways to approach that. But what do you think kind of how that might, what would be the main priorities and what would be trying to address and what would be maybe the way to do it? I think, Jared, you specifically spoke about nuance, which isn't always a strength of this administration. So how would you like to see them go about it, and how do you expect they might go about it? Why don't you start us off, Jared?
Well, I'll just not how I like it, but I can talk about what I expect. I would expect a push among various stakeholders for a rule of origin that is based on the ownership structure of the entity that's exporting. And you start to see a little bit of that with rapid response, right? I mean, I think generally countries were kind of dealt with holistic level. There was a rule of origin. Rapid response, we were going to apply this rule to a specific facility. I don't see a reason why the administration could not enforce something where the country of origin is based on the ownership structure of the entity. I mean, you see a little bit in AD/CVD, people get different tariff rates based on their ownership. So there is precedent for it. And I would expect the administration to push that. While will Mexico agree? I think that's a huge open question.
If no one else wants to speak to rules of origin, why don't we go to the rapid response mechanism? I know we all have lots of thoughts on that, and that I think is been a pretty successful innovation from USMCA if you just judge by the fact of how much it's used. Both the Biden administration and the second Trump administration have been pretty active in invoking the rapid response mechanism with Mexico, and I think almost all of you spoke to it in some level in your kind of your opening question. One, kind of the key question, I think, on rapid response mechanisms is there's a lot of push to make it, more expansive and cover more industries, while also, I think Jared spoke to a little bit of some concerns from the employer side as well. So, with this administration, there are some elements of what they are approaching that are sort of, would be overall good for labor rights if you look at some of the like forced labor in various language in some of their deals, but they, are not, I think, considered a very largely pro-labor administration. So I'm curious, how do you see labor playing into these upcoming talks around the review, and what level of, RRM reform can be, kind of realistically expected from these? Whoever wants to start us off on that front. Jeff, please. Yes.
Go ahead, Patrick.
Sure. I can start just by noting that I think on Capitol Hill and sort of across the political spectrum, the RRM process and structure has been one of the most popular aspects of USMCA to date. And so I certainly don't think it's going anywhere during the review. I agree there might be some procedural tweaks to it. However, I just want to note, and this is referring back to one of Jared's points earlier, I think any effort to change the RRM system so that it applies sort of more broadly and applies more directly to U.S. companies, I do not think there is going to be an appetite within the administration to make those sorts of changes. So the question is going to be how much political capital is the Mexican government willing to spend, and maybe even how much political capital does it have to spend to make those sort of changes to tweak the RRM system so that it applies sort of on both sides of the border more equally.
I would just step back a little bit because, the rapid response mechanism is meant to help enforce the labor reforms that Mexico undertook starting in 2019. And for, I think, us, the bigger concern has to do with the fact that you still have the issue that we were trying to solve with those reforms then was to address these protection contract unions, right? And these are unions that were basically set up by or for the benefit of the employer, sometimes with the direct encouragement of the state or local government, so that they did not represent the actual interests of the workers who they purported to represent. So with this kind of verification process of contracts that the government undertook, you had some unions that independent unions, legitimate kind of yellow and non-yellow unions, be able to step in, organize, and present a viable alternative to the kind of official unions that has kind of represented basically the Mexican industry for the last century. So we've had some successes that were the result of the intervention of USTR, the use of the rapid response mechanism, the famous case of GM and Silao being kind of an important case from the get-go. which saw the transfer of a collective agreement from a yellow union to a legitimate union. But that still, you had at the same time, we're talking about like hundreds of thousands of contracts, right, that went through this verification process. It is clear that in many of the cases, those contracts may have been, to the extent that they were, reapproved, they were done without Mexican government oversight. The votes on these contracts were set and by the incumbent union for the convenience of the incumbent union. And I think in many cases, these protection contracts were eventually kind of washed, laundered in some sense to become legitimate contracts, but really haven't changed either the content or the representative. And then you have a number of contracts that didn't go through the legitimation process that ended under the Mexican legal reforms. The same terms and conditions should have applied even after those contracts disappeared. It is completely unclear whether that actually has happened or not. So you have a very small number of, I think, new contracts with legitimate trade unions behind them. So that seems to be the more fundamental issue we need to get at. And the rapid response can be a part of making that happen. Kind of recent, one-third cut to the federal agency that is in Mexico that's responsible for the administration of registration and administration of labor disputes also doesn't help. That's a major cut. And the fact that there was a process, change in the judiciary last year in Mexico where they went from appointed to elected judges. I'm not taking a position one way or the other, but the fact is most of the labor judges in the country left or were not reelected. So you have a lot of new judges with little experience on these very complex issues. So I think it's going to make for a very complicated labor system in Mexico. With regard to the rapid response, very quickly, I think it is an important innovation. I think where we would like to, it is in fact rapid when you talk about the initial steps of the process. We see, unfortunately, cases that are going to panels. The Atento case took over a year. We have 4 cases now that are awaiting a panel, and it's been over a year. So, it's important when you have these labor disputes, including the potential dismissal of trade union activists, that they are reinstated quickly, or the organizing drive is essentially busted. So the waiting times of over a year, obviously, to get to a panel decision could be strengthened. And we also see in some cases, even when there is a bilateral agreement between U.S. and Mexico, or there's a decision, those aren't being respected necessarily by kind of Mexican labor administration. So I think there's more work to be done on that aspect of it.
And just a quick
Can I-
follow-up,
sorry.
Jeff. Oh, sorry. Just a quick follow-up for Jeff, and then I'll let you chime in, Jared. Do you feel like the unions are going to be able to maybe sell this to the Trump administration? Do you feel like there's an in there that you can maybe find with the administration on moving some of these reforms forward?
Look, I think making sure that workers in Canada, the U.S., and Mexico benefit from the agreement has been the way that the unions have always approached this. That's, I think, how the labor reforms were sold as part of USMCA and the rapid response mechanism. So, there is a legitimate argument around, again, to what the ambassador is saying. Why do we have trade agreements? Yes, obviously is to trade things, but to what end? right? And it is obviously to benefit the people in the three countries we're talking about. If we're really concerned with that as a goal, then yes, I think improving labor standards in all three countries is really important to making sure that the people whose labor makes the goods that and services we put into trade are benefiting from these agreements.
Sorry, go ahead, Jared.
Yeah, no, I'll just say, I'll tell a quick anecdote. When President Trump was elected the first time, our marketing people reached out to us and they said, okay, you got to update your resume, right? You got to update. And I said, look, just, everywhere where you see trade, just add national security. I said, so, Jared Wilson Hogan, expert in trade and national security, right? President Biden won. They come back to me. They say, all right, what are you going to do? I said, just cross out national security and put labor and environment, right? Everything else is the same. Just cross that out. And so President Trump then wins second term. I said, just add labor back onto it. I said, just add national security. I keep them both. And I say that because I'm certainly not going to speculate if, what individuals feel about labor rights, but it's a good way to have a chip to impact trade, right? So whether you believe labor rights or not, if you're trade protectionist, it's a good mechanism to have. And so that's why I kind of I expect it to continue to be a centerpiece, Republican or Democratic administration. I think the other thing I'll say is I think, Jeffrey had mentioned kind of the evolution of some of the unions. I do think one interesting thing that will need to be addressed is the facility-specific nature of the mechanism. I think, USTR's position, I think in the Biden administration was behavior by the unions is attributed to the facility. So if a current union engages in malfeasance, that can go to the facility and to the company's ability to export to the United States. I think, as you start to see, I think as a success of the rapid response, I think as you see more independent unions, you are going to run into cases where unions that are respected in the United States as being independent are accused of doing something to keep another respected independent union out. And the kind of $1 million question for me is, is the United States government going to be willing to attribute the acts of a completely independent union to the company? And by doing so, are you potentially setting up a situation where you're holding a company responsible for what an independent union does? How do you ensure union neutrality by the company vis-a-vis the union if you're going to hold the company responsible for the union's behavior by taking away its export rights? I think that's one thing that I think really is going to have to be grappled with. And you're seeing a little bit of that in the Pirelli case, where the Mexican government is kind of pushing back on what's the definition of facility-specific in the rapid response.
I believe Melinda and Jeff want to pop back in. So,
I would just quickly on this. The reason there may have been an attribution in some cases is because the unions were set up by the company or with the approval of the company or the domination of the company. So it's I think that's going to be less an issue, obviously, of non-company dominated unions. I think that I'm not sure that the attribution issue is going to be one that you're going to see as you have more legitimate unions entering the space, but we'll see.
I just wanted to just jump in quickly around kind of the process questions, because just stepping back, the reason there is an RRM that was not in the original USMCA that was negotiated by the Trump administration. It was pushed strongly by congressional Democrats who, pushed for that, and kind of used their leverage for the vote to improve things. And so I think points to the importance of having congressional oversight onto this. And there was one more thing, but I'll just leave it there because it flew out of my head. I'm sorry. Let me just
go ahead.
The other thing that I would say is that in the conversations we've been having with groups in Mexico and migrant justice organizations, obviously this review is also happening during a time of really draconian immigration policies in the United States, and migrant workers have been raids and so forth. And so I do think that from whether, I'm not saying that this is something that would be easy to kind of push, but it is definitely a demand to protect the rights of workers who have been displaced due to some of these policies. And
I think kind of what a lot of you are getting at in various different ways is that there's kind of a little bit of a question of leverage here. And obviously the U.S. comes in with a lot of leverage, as it frequently does with a lot of its trade negotiations. But there's the leverage of what is Congress going to ask for? Canada and Mexico, there's the leverage of, civil society and business groups. And a lot of different stakeholders have varying levels of, what they're pushing for and what they would like to see and reforms and any number of sort of the laundry list of different things related to USMCA. So, for you, all of you, what kind of leverage do you think is maybe going to be, most effective as we kind of move forward in the coming weeks and months with this review, whether that's from outside stakeholders or Congress or even just like within the administration itself? Where do you see those leverage points? And on what issues in particular would that be maybe most reflective kind of moving forward?
I can speak to the stakeholder piece just to get us started. We're at a point now in the review process where a lot of the formal steps for stakeholders have now ended. So the written comment phase is over, the in-person hearing phase is over. But I do not think that means that the administration's door is now closed to stakeholders. I think, the Trump administration, one thing they said when they came in is that they were going to have an open door for stakeholders, an open door in particular for business. And that has been our experience, is that the folks at USTR and throughout the government have been willing to hear from stakeholders, in particular U.S. businesses. So to the extent you have a policy proposal that you want to push or changes that you think would benefit U.S. consumers, U.S. business, there's absolutely still an opportunity to get in front of the right people in the administration and push those proposals forward. I will say, though, that it is very critical that when you do this, you need to know your audience. The Trump administration has been clear about what its trade policy priorities are. And I really think it boils down to three. That's increasing U.S. jobs, increasing U.S. wages, and lowering the U.S. trade deficit. And then I think you could also throw in expanding the manufacturing base as well. So when you approach the administration with these policy ideas, you need to be able to frame your ideas in ways that show how they're going to further one or more of those policy priorities. And if you find yourself unable or having difficulty doing that, then I think you need to take another look at your policy priorities and think about how you can maybe tweak them so that you can present them in ways that will speak better to the administration.
Yes, I would say that our experience has been less open than perhaps from the business community. So that just to point that out, but I also, one thing that I think is important is that the administration does not appear to be speaking with one voice or even have one objective on these things. And I think there are various within USTR. I think that there is still a real strong sense that we need to try to stop the offshoring of U.S. jobs and address the race to the bottom, and that there are ways to talk about some of these labor and human rights issues in that lens from a perspective. But then I also think there are other people in the administration that is not their goal, and their goal is much more to kind of push the agenda of the largest multinational corporations, particularly when you mentioned digital trade, for example, that I think addressing the digital trade rules that are really about making sure that there is not regulation of data flows, of AI systems, and so forth. That really is not about U.S. jobs in any way. That's about kind of pushing the agenda of big tech companies, and we know that is also a major goal. So I think I would expect that we will see some stakeholders will have a much bigger voice, but I do think that Congress will will push as much as they can to utilize their leverage. And I think that's why it was so upsetting to see that they are not intending to make these basic reports public. And so there will be a major push for transparency by civil society groups as well as folks in Congress, I think, to open up this process so that we have a renegotiation that actually benefits the broad majority of people in the United States and the three countries.
I'll just say, as far as going to the administration, I think in the first Trump administration, there was just a refusal to engage on affordability. I think if you went to the administration and said, this is going to cause an affordability issue, it's just not like knocking your head against the wall. I mean, there just wasn't any willingness to have a conversation about that. It was just the Chinese are going to pay the tariffs. Somebody else is going to pay the tariffs, and it's not going to have an impact. I don't want to be too lawyery here, but on one hand, I see a crack in that. I mean, I do think there's starting to be some willingness to engage on the issue of affordability. But then, President Trump, a little bit to his credit, I have to say, has started to kind of float this idea of, do we really need $37, right? It's the argument, we consume too many dolls, we consume too many pencils. I got to give him some credit. That's a very honest argument, right? Like, that kind of gets to the meat of the matter. Are we as a country going to continue to overconsume, or are we going to say, no, we are not going to overconsume, and these are the policies? I think how that goes, and if President Trump can kind of win that argument that we're overconsuming, but somehow also deal with this affordability issue, if he can navigate that, first of all, it'll be incredibly impressive intellectually, because I don't see how you deal with the two of them. But assuming he can, I think how they master that argument will really play to people as far as going to the administration with, please don't tariff this because it's going to drive prices up.
Well, we are rapidly running out of time, but I do want to close and have you all sort of speak kind of at the end here. We didn't get to everything. Obviously, there's so much on the agenda with the USMCA review, digital trade being one, and a number of many issues. But just kind of to close, what will you be kind of watching, I guess, in the weeks and months ahead? What sort of key factors should we all be looking at to kind of see what the expectations will be as we move forward, and where USMCA kind of might end up down the road? And however you decide you want to speak to that. But let's start from the back way forward this time. And Jared, why don't you kick us off, if you would?
No, I'll reiterate the point I made before. For me, it's how this affordability scarcity issue, how the administration kind of lands on that, I think will dictate. From what I understand, again, from press reports, if the chief of staff and her focus on affordability, if that tends to win, I think that will play one way. If President Trump's apparent instincts to stop buying $37, if that wins, it will go a vastly different way. And I think for me, I'm going to be watching that with great interest.
The overconsumption from the man building a gold-plated ballroom is what to look for. I would just look for a strategy. Would be a good start, and specifically the USMCA. Look, I don't know what is going to be the kind of external measure of. I think for labor, like we've used the formal channels. There will be informal channels, and as with every trade agreement, we've always been making the case around who benefits, right? And I think any measure of any trade agreement, labor has always looked through that lens, and because of that, I think has rejected most of the trade agreements that have been negotiated in the past because they don't fundamentally promote the interests of those who are the generators of whose labor makes the things and services which we trade. The AFL-CIO's interests are, of course, the labor chapter, but also have views on rule of origin. I mean, there's a whole idea around having an auto minimum wage that was linked to that interesting experiment didn't seem to work out in the end, but I think we'll need to experiment again as to whether there are other ways. Mexico itself has raised its minimum wage, but are there other ways in which we can harmonize or at least bring up or shrink the gap in wages and working conditions between the three countries? And yeah, I mean, I think it goes digital trade, of course. There's a lot of organizing of digital platform workers these days. It's going to be really important that we maintain space to, protect worker rights as it pertains to data protection, surveillance, algorithmic management, and all these issues that we're now dealing with at the ILO, but we can't have that undercut by trade disciplines that may cut across or cut against the ability of regulators to protect those kind of interests, while at the same time protecting the interests of those who are using, the digital environment to generate, goods and services. So the interests are wide, and we're going to try to obviously fight for an agreement that is balanced.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting that the USMCA review is kind of like the one kind of potentially, like, there's a structure for us to be trying to influence what the administration's trade policy is. The other reciprocal trade deals have just been rapid fire, completely opaque, no opportunities for anyone, any stakeholder, I believe, I don't know how many, to engage in, we've talked with members of Congress who have had aren't even getting briefed beforehand that it's even happening. And so the USMCA review, I think, is a place where civil society, Congress, and others can lay out. This is actually on the politics of this as well. If the administration's goals are to stop the offshoring of U.S. jobs, to raise wages, what needs to happen to do that and to hold them accountable to those promises? And so whether they take them on board or not, that will be something that the American public will need to see. And what are the priorities? Are the rules that they're pushing about doing that, or is it about pushing other interests? Like, as I mentioned before, big tech. Also, the public health community has been very vocal about congressional Democrats the last time around push to remove some of the extreme monopoly provisions that were being pushed by the pharmaceutical industry in the review, and got some of those removed. There continue to be provisions that extend monopolies for pharmaceuticals and at the expense of access to medicine. So there are a host of issues that I think the American people it is important for them to see what the impact of this negotiation will be. And so, but at the same time, as kind of a yardstick to measure also all of these other deals that are being announced, and are they actually advancing these goals of ending the race to the bottom, or is it really just kind of more of the same in the kind of dressed up as upending the global trading system?
One question that I've been thinking about is whether the Trump administration's goal or its plan is to get to a place where by July 1st, 2026, it's in a position to renew the agreement for another 16-year term. Or if perhaps instead the plan is to get to July 1st, 2026, choose not to renew the agreement, but not withdraw from the agreement either. So that puts the parties in a posture of year-on-year constant negotiations into perpetuity. And I'm wondering if that could be an outcome that's attractive to the administration.
Well, thank you all for a great discussion, and you've raised some great questions here at the end for us to not be able to discuss, but maybe we'll all come back next year and be able to assess how it went. So thank you all again for being here, and thank you all for being here today.